Well, that was certainly a very nice and lovely welcome. Thank you to the department for inviting me tonight. It's always fun when you travel so much and you travel the country or the world working on projects and lectures to be in your home department and look out at a few friendly faces of students. So I really appreciate the opportunity to do that tonight. And I thank you all. I'm going to try to not mess up the situation between the computer here, the stairs here, and this. So if I fall off the ledge here, it's okay to giggle a little bit as long as I don't like break my ankle. So I'm going to do a couple of strange things tonight. I know it's been a really long day, especially I know the Department of Landscape Architecture was out in the field today, starting very early. I assume the architecture and other design students have also been in studio for hours. So I've sort of got a couple of unique things in here. But to start off tonight, make sure I got this working, maybe. You probably might be familiar with Olin, our office, or at least if you're not familiar, you've been in some of our landscapes around the world. For the last about 4.5 decades, our office has really been working to reimagine disinvested American cities and how we think about urbanism. We've worked to build with like exquisite craft in thinking about how design becomes reality with detailing. We've thought a lot about the democratization of space with a huge commitment to public open space. And we continue to do this today, both in the US, but also internationally, as we think about how projects really are the manifestation of our ideals and how sometimes our aspirations as humans can sometimes be best expressed in architecture and design. We do this from a couple of main offices, Los Angeles and Philadelphia, our main offices. We have a few people across the country. And we have between 90 and 100 people at any given time, depending on where we are with interns and other hires, and with people that are really committed to curiosity and passionate about landscape architecture and design. So at this point, I could go and start a very traditional lecture where I pick 3 of my current projects and I take you through excruciating detail about how we decided to make a certain paving pattern or a certain detail and really drill into something about the conceptual design. But I gotta say, when I was a student coming out of studio after 4 or 5 hours of class, I did not find those lectures very inspiring and generally thought, gosh, I could read the Olin monograph, or I could open the LA Times, or I could get the latest issue of Architectural Record and I can learn about the Willis Tower roof park or whatever. So I want to do something very different tonight. I want to pause here before heading down that typical lecture road. And I want to think a little bit more about topics that are more difficult and which I think capture what it truly means to practice landscape architecture and architecture in an engaged way. And I'm really honestly not here to give answers, but really to invite all of you into some of the challenges that I think you will face as you go out into your profession after you graduate. And really think about how we can take a deeper and more rigorous approach to design issues that go beyond just like greenwashing things and be like, oh, it's green, it must be good. And really get at the heart of issues with some of our past practices, especially around equity and infrastructure. So I want to start with this quote from Jedediah Purdy in the book After Nature, A Politics for the Anthropocene, where he says, everyone living today is involved intentionally or inadvertently in deciding what to do with a complicated legacy of environmental imagination and practice, now that all the simple ideas of nature are irretrievably gone. And so this is really, I think, where we're entering practice here today in the 21st century. It's complicated and it's difficult. So I'm going to begin here. This is the flood wall, which is in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, protects people and property from floods. And as you can see, it does a pretty incredible job of that, holding back floodwaters, keeping this community dry as the Mississippi River floods. But all levees and flood walls, they end at some point. They return to grade, come back to a contour, and even our best infrastructure sometimes fails. And yes, there are people that live on the left side of this flood wall. And unsurprisingly, it's the poorer side of the community, which is left out of the protection of this wall and faced at this point almost annually with flooding. And most of folks too poor to move, and really left here from a legacy of development practices. And we see this repeatedly across the United States, where equity in our infrastructure is a major issue. We see it in the 11th Street Bridge across the Anacostia that we're working on. We see it with Rebuild by Design in the Bronx in New York. We see it along the Mississippi here. And yes, we see it at the LA River here in Los Angeles. Coming a little closer to where we sit tonight, a second sort of topic. Here in the state of California, over the next 75 years, we can expect about 5,900 acres of additional development. And you can see where it's putting pressure in these red areas. I think sometimes we think, oh, that's a thing of the 20th century. We're not just gobbling up our landscape anymore. But here you can see the scale of the state of Delaware by 2100. And yet we're facing an increasingly unstable climate, which you all know at this point. Here you can see the drought indicator tracking from 2012 to most recently last year, and some of the pressure that we're seeing with climate uncertainty, less snowpack predictability, and increased pressure on our ecosystems. And so while maybe there is a lot of water across the state, much of it is tied up in agriculture, which I'm sure many of you know, Allison's research shows. And interestingly, many of our most vulnerable populations actually struggle to have water for basic use. Again, people that often can't move or don't have the resources to just turn on more water or pay for higher water rates. In fact, 17.1% of homes in the Los Angeles region spend more than 7% of their income on water services. But we actually have a lot of water sometimes. So this is the Los Angeles River. This is about a 4-year event, so it's not even that big of a storm event happening here. And we have all this water. So everybody obviously is like, gosh, what is going on here in LA? I love this quote from Cadillac Desert, where it says, had humans never settled in Los Angeles, evolution left on its own in a million more years might have created the perfect creature for LA, the camel with gills. It's kind of funny, right? It's really true. The obvious question when you start to think of something like the Los Angeles River is, why is it concrete when we have to think about we need more water getting into our underground aquifers, we need more water for our water supply, we need more water for our local ecosystems. And it's complicated. So many of you guys might have seen some statistics like this. So we built so close to the Los Angeles River over time that to be able to go back to something that's more of like a natural condition of that dry wash without causing all sorts of flood issues in our urban area would actually require the river channel to be something like on average 5 times wider than it currently is. And right now, about 35% of the land use in that area along the LA River is actually housing, and we're in a housing crisis. And so there's this question of, gosh, how do I do creative ecological things along the LA River without exasperating the problem of housing and displacement? And so then the next question is like, well, what could we do in the watershed to be able to get more water into our aquifer and to be able to reduce the pressure on the LA River channel when it rains a lot? This is a kind of complicated slide. So I'm going to try to break it down a little bit for you. The LA River watershed is 830 square miles. Sounds like a lot, but it's a fairly small watershed. And interestingly, a lot of that watershed is actually in the mountainous areas that are about up to 7,000 feet above sea level. When it rains hard, even though those mountains are permeable, we get a lot of quick runoff coming out of those mountains. And so what we've studied is we're understanding that even a 25% increase in the permeability of the watershed overall would only take a few percent off of the peak flows in the Los Angeles River. And you're like, how can that be? And I'm like a landscape architect, I want like permeable surface to solve every problem in the world. Like permeable surface is the answer, you know, permeable pavers, permeable soil. But what happens is after soils and paving are so saturated, in these very large storms, they start to behave like paved surface. And so you still get a ton of runoff. And if you think about it historically, the Los Angeles River flooded before there was even any pavement in the watershed. So it makes sense. It's like, this is a flashy flooding system, always was, even when we saw the Spanish explorers, they wrote in their diaries about a miles wide river. So it's interesting because we get in this situation where we have needs around water use, we have needs around flood safety, and we have a lot of desire to improve the ecological conditions of the watershed because we see a history and a current reality of significant environmental burdens along not just the LA River, but a lot of our infrastructure. And so here you can see this is the Cal Enviro screen, which looks at environmental conditions across the state of California. In the red means that this is in the worst 10 percentile of the entire state in terms of environmental burden. And so when you look at this, you can see that the Los Angeles River flows through some of the most burdened and underserved communities in our entire county. And so we have this legacy of infrastructural systems that we really want to improve, make better. We want to get more water recharging our groundwater. We want to get more ecological systems, more trees, more shade connectivity in all of these systems. Because we have, and we also have this very large housing problem. So since 2012, homelessness in LA County has been skyrocketing. Many of you probably know this. We're up to about 70,000 persons experiencing homelessness across the county. And we have an affordable housing shortage that's about 500,000 units of affordable housing shortage. Most of those are in the very deeply low or low income categories. Whew, so that's tricky. And then one last very complicated thing, in case you didn't think it was complicated enough. We want to make things better. We want to solve our inequities in our infrastructure. We want to solve housing issues. And we want to make things better in these neighborhoods. But we know from precedent research that when we do things like parks and improvements along our infrastructural systems, we can actually have a very negative impact on the communities that we're meant to serve. So we're trying to make something better by building a park or building a better infrastructural system. And we end up actually making it so that people that live there currently can't afford to live there. So this often gets referenced as green gentrification, which is an accurate statement. I prefer to talk about this as displacement because we're displacing people that are currently living there. So these are three great projects, right? The 606 West in Chicago, the Atlanta Beltline, the Austin Greenways, really like excellent design projects, but that came and did not necessarily have really strong equity principles from the get-go. And unfortunately, we can look back at them in retrospect, and we can see some of the impacts on the neighborhood. When we look at something like the 606, which is a beautiful project, I want to say, this is a Michael Van Valkenburg Associates project, really lovely project. And obviously this was not an intention, I'm sure, of Michael's team, but what ended up happening, and you can see in the studies afterward, when you look at this as a precedent for, say, what might happen along the LA River, they noticed that there is a massive increase in what people were willing to pay to live adjacent to the 606. And this was happening before the project even broke ground. So people were coming in and saying, I'll buy up here, knowing that in a few years, this great park is going to be here. And the worst thing is that on the west side of the trail, which was the historically poorer community, they saw that increase being most significant. In comparing it to Chicago as a whole, along the 606 West, they saw 140% price change over 16 years, whereas Chicago overall was only 55%. So a really big signal that when we try to, as designers, make something better and improve it for the community, we can actually make it a challenge for people to be able to afford to live there. So welcome to a complex future that gets more and more complex all the time. when we think back to that first image that I showed you 45 years ago that Olin was doing at Bryant Park in Manhattan, the fact that it was raising the costs in that neighborhood's value was like heralded as a huge achievement. If we did something in my office today that was like that, we would be displacing a population. And so being really aware of some of the challenges that we're facing, I think is incredibly important. So infrastructure inequity is a major issue. We're seeing that this is repeatedly a signal across the country. But I'm going to offer hopefully a little bit of hope tonight. I love one last quote as we finish this portion here. Martin Luther King Jr., who was an activist, civil rights leader, American Baptist pastor, he wrote, "The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice." And I really love that, because when you're doing this day in and day out, it can feel a little overwhelming that you can't solve every single thing. I just outlined 3 big sort of global challenges, and there are obviously more. It can get overwhelming that you can't solve them all. But tonight I want to challenge everyone here as designers to think about how we might more holistically lean into this statement. How could we get closer to justice more quickly if all of us really took on that role that we're trying to get towards that? I realize we work for clients a lot of the time. I realize that we work in an increasingly complex, climate unstable, biodiversity, mass extinction issues, social justice atrocities are happening daily world. So I'm not suggesting that you can solve every single thing tomorrow morning, but how do we lean into this? And where do we begin? So tonight, I told you I was going to do something a little different in terms of how I was going to present this. I have 3 suggestions, maybe, that you can take or leave for how you might think about how you practice. So the first one is work at the scale of the problem. This one's kind of fun. So for this one, I'll just talk for a second about an effort called Land Management at Scale that we're working on in our Olin Labs group. So Olin Labs is our research arm. We have a whole series of either pro bono or grant funded or sort of project adjacent efforts that we do in our research group to be able to tackle challenges from the smallest soil particle up to, very large issues across the country. And so this one really started with the premise of saying, well, gee, 96% of the United States, the continental United States, is rural land. And landscape architects were often engaged in urban areas. That is good. I do not want to say that that is bad. That is good stuff. But there's a lot other things going on out there. And so when you start breaking this down, you see that we have a ton of forest land, we have a ton of pasture land, we have a ton of row crops. I love this map. This is a Bloomberg map showing just how much, so this upper corner in the pinks are urban and urban commercial. And then it just gives you a sense of just really how much of our country is made up of these other land uses that by and large, designers don't engage that much in. However, interestingly, a lot of the climate injustice issues that I would suggest the people in this room are very passionate about are won or lost at this scale. And what I mean by that is to truly achieve like net carbon zero, or to really truly achieve a like justice equality, we have to be able to think at the scales of regional economies, of cross sections of livability, and some of these different scales of settlements and how they interact. I do want to be clear, though, that thinking at the scale of a problem is not defined by just bigness alone. This is not just saying like think big, because often thinking at scale and at scale work is achieved on a site-by-site basis, accomplished like shovel by shovel, tree by tree through that process. The point of working at scale is to really understand how the overall system is functioning and how thinking at that and understanding that scale can emancipate potential for what you might do on an individual site. So here you can see just a quick diagram showing how some of these largest land uses tie to a lot of things that we're very interested in, whether it be jobs, climate, justice. And I want to be clear, this is not like the first time that anyone ever thought of doing something at a large scale. If you think back to like the New Deal, whether, some of the outcomes we would question today, certainly if we look through our current lens, but you have to admire the scale of what some of the things that they achieved. The CCC alone planted like 3.5 billion trees in the 1930s. Or if you look back even a little bit further before that and you look to the scale of what Olmsted Sr. or Jens Jensen or O.C. Simons were doing, they were definitely thinking on the scale of their regional landscapes and how they intertwined together. Olmsted is obviously incredibly famous for his work in starting a lot of what we think of as our national parks movement in the 1860s with some of the work around Yosemite Valley. So they were definitely thinking about that. But the question of, gosh, what were they trying to preserve and how do we pull that? What are we trying to preserve today? This is interesting, and this is based on an essay that was written about what has really driven land protection in the state of California. And this person posits that originally it was about aesthetics, really bringing forward, how do we protect our forests? Then in the early 20th century, thinking about water management, land availability, economics, you see a lot of things happening in that era. By the time we get to the 1960s and 1970s with some of like Rachel Carson's work around Silent Spring and something like the EPA Clean Water Act, we see a lot more about species and biodiversity. And most recently in the past decade or two and a half maybe, we see a lot of energy going into addressing climate change when we think about preserving and thinking about our lands. And so what's next? How might we step into even a more holistic understanding of what it truly means to align land conservation, multi-benefit use, and justice? There's some good momentum around this. There's the 30 by 30. This is, if you're not familiar, an effort to conserve 30% of the United States land by 2030. And there's a lot of conversation around, gosh, what lands should count in being truly conserved? How do we think about conservation easements? How do we think about rangelands? Do they also count? Another effort that's happening is the Justice 40 initiative, which is looking at spending 40% of funding in historically underserved communities. So when you think about that, it starts to get at the scale of some of the topics that we're talking about, thinking about at scale. And so what we're talking here is we're trying to think what, how, and who could we start to do at scale work. First of all, if we're talking about what lands do we focus on? Second, how could we move beyond what have historically been very siloed land uses? And third, who could be better coordinated? How would we bring together people to do that? It's a really complex topic, and obviously nothing that I'm talking about tonight is straightforward. Everything from conservation to working lands to open space and public land come into this conversation. On a site scale, you think of a scale of something like this. This is a forested land in the state of California. And then when you start to imagine how these sites could truly be multi-benefit, how do we think about recreation? How do we think about wildfire management? How do we think about conservation easements? And how do we think about all of these things instead of siloed uses? How do we think about them jointly in multi-benefit ways? This sort of at scale thinking then allows us to make better design decisions on a single site when we zoom in. Part of this requires understanding what's truly a multi-benefit strategy. And so right now, one of the exercises that we're doing is looking at everything from access, physical practices, economics, and policy issues, and trying to bring those into very understandable strategies for individual sites. And so this is kind of like a card deck, if you will, to think about different, in the example here of land trusts and conservation easements. And so what we're thinking about is how do we start to frame this for clients in a way that they could imagine a more multi-benefit use for their land? And so if you're working with a client that maybe has 50,000 acres or 100,000 acres, how do you start to think about this at scale? And then how does that affect their decision-making on an individual site? Super interesting. Historically, when we think about land that is ideal for development, like when we think about that little red inching across the state of California, those 5,900 new acres of development by 2100, a lot of times that ideal for development land is contiguous with other urban areas, it's access to jobs or transportation. And when we look at lands that are ideal for protection, sometimes they're the same land, right? We're like, oh gosh, wouldn't it be nice if this urban wildland interface could be protected? Or wouldn't it be nice if we could have a recreation easement? So the big idea here being, gosh, if we just do the default, what has happened, say, for the last 100 years in the United States in most places, is development just keeps eating up our sensitive lands, which then limit our opportunities in the future for both conservation, but also multi-benefit ecological services. Starting in the 70s, I think a lot of people, 60s, 70s, were pushing, think about like Ian McHarg's work with suitability analyses, or you think about some of the work that was started with the EPA Clean Water Act, is this idea of the conservation development, like if you mitigate this by doing a wetland over here, then you can do that over there, and there are these trade-offs. And I would argue that in that middle diagram, kind of everything becomes a little bit less than possibly good. Ideally, we know the world is growing, we know the population is growing, we know there will be some level of development. Ideally, if we can get ahead of thinking about that, how might we actually redirect development in a smarter way? And so the first thing here with land prioritization is to imagine, well, gee, how would we start to decide what things to prioritize? And this is something that I think is really interesting. When we talk about how only in understanding the system can we start to emancipate potential, I think that maps are a really interesting way to start to imagine this. So mapping can be a way of exploring what you believe in. And I think a lot of times, especially, when you make a map in Studio, for example, you're making a map as an end product. You're standing up to present it. Look at my beautiful map. It's complete. But how could we start to think about mapping as more of a tool, as a way of seeing, as a way of shifting a paradigm, as a way to actually explore a topic? So these are some tests that we've started to do looking at both the state of California, but also the United States as a whole, to understand in terms of our overall system, where are the pressure points? Where are the regional geographies that are most at risk? And so when we're working either on a research project like this, which is at our own initiative, or we're working with clients, whether they be states or trusts or whatever it might be, to be able to actually have a really frank conversation about how their property fits into this overall ecosystem. And then if we have that information, we start to make sharper decisions about it. Okay, that's one. Think at the work at scale, right? Okay, see, this thing is very, very sneaky here. I almost did it again. If I fall over that like 3 times by the end of the night, like 6 years from now, people are going to be like, remember that lecture when that girl, what was her name, kept falling? Okay, the second one. It's good we can all laugh together. Tackle difficult and real transdisciplinary learning. It's difficult, as it says here. This is something that I think architecture and landscape architects, we pay a lot of lip service sometimes to being transdisciplinary, but we don't necessarily put it into practice. So for this, I'm going to talk for a second about a little of the LA River Master Plan, which is a project that I think many of you are familiar with. The LA River Master Plan was just adopted this summer by the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors in June. It is the first update of the overall master plan since 1996. Involved a 4.5-5 year public process to get to this point. And all of that's very interesting, and you can go and read about it on the website or in the LA Times. But I want to actually talk about it through the lens of really being transdisciplinary. And again, I should have just clicked to this slide a second ago. Over 1 million people participated in the process, either digitally or online. And really to be able to reimagine the Los Angeles River. And so this is really an interesting transdisciplinary issue because a lot of planning has been done along the LA River, some of it very, very good. Some of it for only pieces and parts and different sections of the river led by different jurisdictions and authorities. But the idea of a 51-mile long, overarching, holistic master plan that includes not just hydrology and ecology, but also includes social aspects, believe it or not, go back 5 or 6 years, was sort of like not, I don't want to say revolutionary, that sounds really fancy, but a lot of the planning that had been done before maybe looked at the hydrology very specifically, or maybe looked very specifically at the ecology, or maybe looked very specifically at development, but didn't necessarily look at housing or look at issues of community social justice issues. So this is what LA County Public Works set out to do. And what's a little crazy about that is that Public Works, which is a entity that is technically the flood control district, so historically a very heavily engineering entity, is suddenly leading an overall plan about equity along the Los Angeles River. Kind of blows your mind when you think about it deeply. So for those of you that might not be familiar, just a quick, like 2 or 3 slides here to get you up to speed on the LA River. It's 51 miles long. It starts in the West San Fernando Valley in Canoga Park, city of Los Angeles, flows for 51 miles, first through the southern part of the San Fernando Valley, takes a turn towards the south at Griffith Park, flows through the Glendale Narrows, past downtown Los Angeles, and then through Vernon and the southeast cities where it empties into the Pacific Ocean in Long Beach at River Mile 0. About 1 million people live within a mile of the river, making this a significant piece of infrastructure in the state of California. 1/3 of all Californians live within a 1-hour drive of the LA River. It's like, yeah. LA River goes through a lot of different situations in the 51 miles. It's not the same everywhere, which means that one single design solution doesn't really answer every single stretch of the river. Of course, I have to do something to turn this a little on its head, so it's a little different than something you might see in a public lecture, like a county lecture about the river. At first, you're like, okay, well, the LA River, we're going to make this great linear infrastructure, right? That's what we've been talking about tonight. And so you start looking at some precedents. You're like, oh, it could be LA's High Line, or what is this? How does this compare to Central Park? And you look at this and you're like, the LA River is operating at an entirely different scale than all of these other sort of parks. Let's put it in this scale. This is some of the largest infrastructure projects that have been taken on over the last few decades in the country and across the state of California. So when you take the LA River and you put it next to the Tunnel and Reservoir Project in Chicago, or the LA Aqueduct, or the State Water Project, or the Colorado Aqueduct, you're like, wow, this scale is actually not only achievable, but it's quite reasonable when we think at the scale of how we reimagine infrastructure. And so when you start looking at this scale, you got to really understand how to make this a transdisciplinary conversation beyond just, how do we make the rendering green as landscape architects, but how do we really make this a system that works? Because the LA River, as I said quite distinctly at the beginning of this lecture, while I was falling on the ground. So in case you missed it, let me repeat, historically flooded quite a lot across its plain. And that's because the steepness of the mountains, the water rushes down really quickly. There were a lot of wetlands here. In the summer months, the river would totally dry out. And in the winter months, it might be like a soupy grassland. Comprehensive planning for our region has not been absent historically. And many of you might be familiar with the Olmsted-Bartholomew Plan, 1929-1930, which actually looked at the entire region and proposed 71,000 acres of parkland. wow, right? You're like, great, let's do that. Why didn't we do that? There were a lot of governance issues with this. It was also on the eve of the Great Depression. There's some great writing that Bill Deverell has done on this. You should read it. I won't dig into it, but suffice to say, we didn't, unfortunately, do this. And we ended up, and as in the Olmsted report, he actually wrote, if we don't get ahead of this, the Los Angeles region will tend to strangle itself with development. Not long after that plan, some very significant floods really sealed the fate of this system. The 1938 flood gets referenced a lot as the reason why the Los Angeles River got completely, finally, totally channelized and concretized. And there have also been a few big storms since. Excuse me. This is 1969. And I think this picture is awesome. You can't actually even tell which direction the river is flowing. And today, we think of the LA River as something that's like pretty static. It's been that way for a long time. And I think a lot of people that live along it feel safe. But actually, a lot of the river is undersized for what we know is a current sort of flood level that, say, FEMA would like the river to be at. We see that a significant amount of Southeast LA, all that area in blue, is in the 500-year floodplain, which if you look at some recent things that have happened, say like in Houston, or in some other places, those storms are becoming more and more likely. And what we're seeing in LA is that what was the 1% storm is more like now the 67-year storm. So we're seeing an increased interval of this. And we're seeing that over the past 50 years, we've had significant flooding about every 3.5 years. So coming together to understand with engineering professionals how we could really reimagine the LA River is critical. So one of the things that we worked here on was what we called the LA River Ruler. And this linearization of the river, which many of you might have seen before, was the idea of creating almost like a DNA strand for the river and forcing our entire team, whether they be landscape architects, sociologists, housing specialists, engineers, architects, etc., to use this system to be able to understand the data. So if you look at the LA River and you take like 50 maps like this and you overlay them, pretty much everything just looks like mud, right? Like all the colors overlay and you can't read anything anymore. So the idea of this was to be able to quickly look for patterns along the Los Angeles River where we might see social, environmental, and engineering topics overlapping very quickly. So this is just an example where high park need is and how that might relate to high areas of environmental burden. So we did this with over 200 data sets. And again, some of those data sets have layers and layers and layers, and all of the different disciplines committing to working in this same system so that everything could come together. So there were 9 goals that the community across the region came up with, everything from flood to housing to engagement, to education, water quality, water supply, parks, equity, ecosystems. And how that data set allowed us to look for those trends and look for those patterns, and then come up with a series of need maps to be able to catalog some of the highest needs in communities along the river that now communities and organizations can use to prioritize improvements along the LA River. The intent here is to then be able to take those needs that overlap them with opportunity areas and an equitable cadence along the river to be able to reimagine the river through a series of projects over the next 25 years. And so here you can see there's all scales from extra small up to extra large. Some of these are planned major projects that are already underway, and other ones will be coming online in the next 25 years at different intervals. And the point here is not to prescribe what a community should have, because when we think about the community needs, they're varied along the river. And so the plan provides a series of technically feasible strategies that local communities then can utilize, working with the flood control district, working with LA County, working with neighborhood groups and other nonprofits to be able to imagine what they would want in their neighborhood. The way that it works, because again, this is very transdisciplinary, is each of those hydraulically technical feasibility studies gets linked to what we also have as biodiversity profiles. How do we start to think about wildlife and plant species along the river, and how each of those could be more fully realized in each of those different conditions, depending on each community's needs. This is like the really nerdy behind the scenes stuff, where you see coming together on all of the data of how different plant communities, this is just one page of like 178 pages of how these plant communities and the biodiversity profiles can overlay with the engineering aspects of the LA River. Since I talked so much about getting more water into our groundwater, I want to specifically say that those 22 sites that have been identified, the strategy around those is the idea to then capture water and help get it back into the groundwater into the aquifer. So this is another example of overlaying site design, engineering, and thinking about how we actually create these multi-benefit systems that both benefit humans above ground and our aquifers below ground. But obviously over time, those needs and opportunities will shift. And so recognizing that what's a need today might not be the same in 10 or 15 years. If you look back at the 1996 LA River Master Plan, it was actually heralding development along the LA River. If you look at today's plan, you will not see that in the LA River Master Plan. Market rate development is not an issue that we have today in 2022 along the Los Angeles River. Instead, we need affordable housing, we need displacement mitigation initiatives, and we need to be thinking holistically about some of those social pressures and environmental justice. So with this, to truly be resilient as we think about that design requires a long-term strategy that thinks about adaptation of the river long in advance of a natural disaster. So unfortunately, it's probably not a question of if there will be a flood that overtops the Los Angeles River. It's more of a question of when. Will that occur next week when we get the storms that are expected? Will that occur next year? Will that occur in 50 years or 100 years? I don't know. But I know that it's critical that we think as a region in advance of that, of how we would build back better and how we think about this idea of rethinking before rebuilding the exact systems we have. If we went back 100 years and had the opportunity to re-engineer the entire system, I think many of us would probably make different decisions than are there right now. But to go in and imagine just like displacing massive amounts of people today is very difficult to imagine or do. But if there were a disaster, rethinking that system is critical. And so this sort of transdisciplinary willingness to question and think about the engineering as it relates to our work is in critical importance. And then lastly, but certainly not least, recommendation, understanding that equity isn't a zero-sum game. So I'm borrowing from Heather McGee, who her book, The Sum of Us, is a great read. If you haven't read it, it's also very, very readable. But she puts forth this idea of the solidarity principle in that book. And what she's basically pointing out through a whole series of examples across history is that we all do better when we all do better. And unfortunately, a lot of decisions that are made from the policy all the way down to the design level imagine that somebody has to lose for somebody to gain, right? And her point, Heather McGee's point in this entire book is like, that's actually not true. When somebody's losing, we all suffer through increased medical costs to society, increased municipal costs. We all have, pay for, like, higher crime becomes an issue. And there are just example after example of this idea of the solidarity principle. So for this, one more example to return to the LA River, coming back to this idea of housing and pressures of displacement along the LA River. This is something we spent a lot of time on, is understanding how, if improvements were made, like that I was just showing you along the LA River, how would it affect housing prices? And you can see here, areas in yellow are places that are already experiencing advanced gentrification, advanced displacement. That makes sense. You see like the Arts District, right? Like that's been happening over the last 10 to 15 years. Areas in dark purple are experiencing some displacement already, and the lighter purple are either at risk or vulnerable. Adding another layer to that, you can see outlined in black are tracts where rent increases would change them to one risk category higher. And why that's important is because if a new park gets built, say along the Los Angeles River, and suddenly Lucia, who's like, excellent, I want to go live by that new park, I have all of this money to spend, and a landlord, especially in a city that, like a lot of the Southeast cities that don't have rent control, are like, great, Lucia is willing to pay 30% more than my current renter is paying here. Excellent, come on in. See you later, Paul. So that sort of thing unfortunately happens. And we see that renters are at, like, they're like the first people to go in a neighborhood that's experiencing displacement, right? It takes a little longer for a property owner that might own their home. So we have to think proactively about those communities. And so I didn't expect, 15, 20 years ago when I was in architecture school and in landscape architecture school that I would become knowledgeable about housing policy. But here we are, getting a lot of education really quickly over the last 7 or 8 years about housing, because we're experiencing this not just on the LA River, but on projects across the country. And so what are we doing? What are ways to actually mitigate this? Things like tenant support, tenant protections, rent control, policy changes for things like inclusive zoning are incredibly important. Thinking about how we expand county services, for example, for smaller communities, say like Cudahy, who don't have the staff to write an inclusive zoning policy. So those things are all incredibly important, and we have to do them and we have to help them forward. What's a way that we as like designers of physical space can also really tangibly contribute to that? So this is one thing that a project that we're actively doing right now with LA County. This is for the LA County Affordable Land Bank. And so as I mentioned, we're about 500,000 units of affordable housing short. And so in moving forward with a lot of these infrastructure projects, the county supervisors are really aware that if this isn't done well, they will actually displace a lot of the residents that this is made to be for. It takes a lot of time. This is maybe a news flash that I don't know if everybody wants to hear. It takes a long time to get from a concept to like standing in your finished landscape or you're standing in your finished building. I assume everybody in the room got that on day one of architecture school. It could take 5, 10, 15 years. My London Embassy project, 10 years from competition to standing there completed. Unfortunately, speculators and developers work a lot faster than that. And so when you think of something like the LA River Master Plan, if I'm like a developer looking to make a lot of money, which is okay, I'm not against people making money, but what I would do is, Takako is, I see it. So she's not against it, okay. So you want to be. But if I were a smart developer right now, I would be looking at those pink sites in that map I showed you along the LA River, and I would be going to those communities and I would be like, I'm gonna buy some land by this new multi-benefit infrastructure park project that LA County intends to build in the next 5 to 10 years. And they would buy it tomorrow because they have lots of money and they have the resources and they probably have a whole staff of interns researching property purchases. So we have to get ahead of that. And we can't get ahead of that by building the affordable housing tomorrow because it takes time to build buildings. So what we need to do is we need to lock in land today that will be built into affordable housing. There's some sort of percentage, experts debate how much, somewhere on the order of 20 to 35% of a neighborhood, if it is affordable housing, whether that's mandated affordable housing or naturally occurring affordable housing, you can keep market rate from running away from you. And so that's important because if we can think, we don't have to have all housing in a neighborhood doesn't have to be affordable, but some does to be able to keep that displacement from getting away. So this is the idea of banking the land for affordable housing today and using it. The idea of acquiring the land, working with the county affordable housing land bank to hold it for interim use while an RFP is developed, while a building is designed, and then developing that housing. I'm really excited to say that just a couple of weeks ago, the county put $50 million behind the pilot project for this with the intent to purchase the first 6 to 9 properties for land banking along the Los Angeles River. So that's probably the exciting news that I have for you. And the benefit to that is this thing that equity is not a zero-sum game, because by improving things for the least, for the most marginal communities that maybe have been historically underserved, historically redlined, some things were accidental, but some things were absolutely purposeful when you look across history. And they have actually made things not great across the board. And so when we think of our infrastructure and equity, I think thinking at the scale of the issue, thinking transdisciplinarily, and not looking at it as a zero-sum game are just 3 tools to help us tackle some of these really tough challenges. And if you're not up for complicated, check out of architecture, because I think it's complicated, but it's also the best thing you will ever do. Like the best thing you'll ever do. So I think we have a little bit of time for questions, and Takako is going to moderate, maybe?
No, you can moderate.
I'll moderate. I will try to not fall. Maybe I'll stand here. Yeah. Any questions? Yeah. Sure, of course. I would be delighted. So the Affordable Housing Land Bank would be like a department in LA County with the sole purpose of looking at where LA County parks and infrastructure projects are going to be coming online in the next decade or 2. And they would be looking in the neighborhood around it for vacant parcels or underutilized parcels, or maybe places that need to be renovated. And they would proactively purchase that land or building with the overall framework that it would be held in perpetuity to create housing that is affordable. And so they might say like, oh, look, there's this park that's going to be built in Southgate. We're evaluating 2 or 3 properties around it. This one looks great. It's 2 acres. We're going to buy it today. They would do all the real estate work to purchase it. And then they would work with a local, most likely a local nonprofit or a local community land trust, to then develop that into housing. So it would probably still be developed by either an affordable housing developer or a local community land trust. But the county would essentially be saying, hey, community land trust, we bought some land. Would you, you got kicked out. We'll offer this to Eva. We have some land. Do you want to partner in, building this affordable housing? Is that helping? Yeah. Yeah. And so it could happen a couple of different ways. So right now, the pilot, the $50 million pilot that's now been initiated, we'll be looking at vulnerable neighborhoods at risk of displacement. And we'll be looking probably at least for 1 in every supervisorial district to get going. Over time, the idea is that more dollars can also be invested in it. And depending on how a particular project is developed, it could also start to feed dollars back into the land bank. So it could start to be almost like a revolving fund. So once a property is developed as affordable housing, it could help feed back in for future properties to be purchased. There's several different ways, and that's actually what we're helping the county right now strategize around. The pilot will be super telling. Yeah. And then county departments will, this interim use thing, because it could be hanging out for like a year or 2, waiting for construction to start. So that interim use is the big thing, which at the most basic level could just be something like Public Works taking care of it. At a fancy level, it could be like a pop-up park for a couple of years. So there's a couple of different ways to think about that. It's a great question. It's very interesting. I will say, so when they adopted the LA River Master Plan in June, the County Board of Supervisors passed the motion to target the creation of this. And then like 8 weeks later is when they put the first 50 million in the pilot. It's really exciting that they're putting real dollars into it.
Okay, so for
Sure.
So I think this is kind of a question out of ignorance because I'm really not sure. So like,
Okay.
I'm thinking there could be a situation where it's like, you know, land is suddenly going to be more valuable, so the developers who are like maybe in lower income areas selling like Fido land for more, which would in theory give them like economic opportunity. Is there a way like architecture to do that too, where it's like, oh, here's the landscape, like how can it benefit the people who live there to then give them more wealth? I guess like, is that something that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question because there are several really interesting things happening in that. One is, this is why the word gentrification, I think, gets misused a lot, because gentrification doesn't necessarily have to be bad. People that own property bank on the fact that I brought property today and next year it will be worth more, and the next year it will be worth more, and then in 50 years it will be worth a lot more. And so there is a good side to the appreciation of the value of your home. And then there is a good side, to your point, to being able to sell that to make a profit, especially if you want to move, right? And you're like, excellent, developer Takako is going to buy my house. She's paying me a fair price. I'm happy to move. So to say that all gentrification is bad or unwanted would be untrue. It's an interesting question to imagine how architecture might think about how to amplify the good sides of it, while still the bad side is like people that don't want to go anywhere, that can't afford to live anymore in that place. So how could you amplify one while thinking not the other? I think there are a couple of interesting strategies. One is the community land trust model, I think, is starting to imagine how you might help people. So for anybody that doesn't know, a community land trust, this idea that the community owns the land in some ways, or owns the buildings. There's just several different models. But the idea is that there is an appreciation of value for participating in that, but it's not like a runaway model. So I think that could be an interesting thing to explore if you want to understand more about it and how we might design for that. And there is a lot of work in LA County happening around community land trusts. There are also good examples around the country. And I think, you know, this thing about developers moving quickly and architecture moving slowly, it's interesting because we're often in architecture working for a client. And so you're waiting for a client to reach out, and then you're giving them a proposal. And there's this process of design and back and forth settling on the design. I do think that there are models of practice that are proactively creating projects and then looking for funding. So I think there's a model of imagining how, as an architect, you might actually write your own scope of work. You might actually apply for your own grant through housing and urban development and then get ahead of that cycle. I think we're doing more of that. That's part of the reason why Olin Labs exists. I'll be totally honest, it's 5% of our practice today. Would I love to stand up here in 15 years and say that's 50% of our practice? Absolutely. Because I think waiting for someone to call you and say, hey, I have a great idea is slow. Let's put it that way. So great question. Yeah, great question. Back in the back. Mm-hmm.
Do you know of any instances?
That's a great question. So the question is about development plans as it relates to historic resources. I'll actually also add to that indigenous resources that we have here in terms of Native peoples. It's a great question. So one of the interesting things about, say, like the Los Angeles River, which a lot of people want to completely tear out the concrete. There's also a group of people that like want to make the concrete into a national landmark, right? Because it's this, and then there are a lot of bridges along the Los Angeles River that are historically protected. So there's definitely a lot of interesting sort of back and forth. And there are a lot of communities along the Los Angeles River and just across Los Angeles County in general that have a really deep history, not just in the 20th century, but going back hundreds and even thousands of years, especially when we look at some of the indigenous sites. So it's really interesting. There's actually a couple of mapping exercises that are underway right now. So the Ferdinand Tatavium are currently working on a comprehensive like village map of the San Fernando Valley relative to tribal history, which is really interesting. And we see, like, when you look along the Los Angeles River up in Reseda, which is there on that map, there was a village there, Siutkanga, historically. And so there's a lot of attention paid to how new parks, new projects might disrupt those cultural and heritage resources. For better or for worse, the state of California has something called CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. And in that, it requires a comprehensive analysis of historic resources, both cultural, indigenous, et cetera, for any project that gets to come online. And so actually, and I won't go into a ton of detail, but if you look at the program environmental impact report for the LA River, it does like an analysis of some of those different considerations. So it's a huge topic. I think it's, you know, LA is always the city that is thought of as the city that's continuously reinventing itself, like tearing things down and build, like we're in the process of rebuilding our art museum right now, which our office is working on. So I'm not saying anything bad about that, about the LACMA rebuilding, but you don't see as many cities across the world that sometimes are willing to part with historical resources as quickly as LA has been to over the last 100 years. So I think it's a great question. I think it's probably another one of those great challenges in a city like Los Angeles is how do you honor the past? I think just really in the last 10 to 15 years has the Los Angeles region come to understand and realize the depth of the indigenous knowledge of this watershed before it was sort of obliterated in the 1800s. I think there's a lot of learning to continue to do there. It's a great question. Any other questions? I saw one other hand. Yes, sir. Mm-hmm. Yeah, great. These are great questions. So most park needs assessments just globally look at three different things. One, they look at just the total acreage of parks per person. Two, they look at something called park pressure, which has a lot to do with population density around a park. So for example, if I live by myself in the middle of nowhere next to a 1 acre park and I have it all to myself, it's like, excellent, great park. Now, if suddenly all of you move in next to me and we all have to share that 1 acre park, that park's under a lot of park pressure. That's park pressure, number two. And number three is distance to a park. Most professionals would agree that everybody should be within a 15-minute walk, 10 to 15-minute walk of a park. So those three criteria are what are going into this overall park need assessment. You can actually get really granular on a neighborhood basis here in Los Angeles. The overall LA County goal is to have 4 acres of park per 1,000 people. And some communities, like especially a lot of these communities in green, are like blowing that out of the water. They're doing great. They might even have 6 or 8 acres of per person. When we get to some of these red areas, Many of them are down in like the 0.8 to 1 acre of parks per 1,000 people. So can you imagine sharing 1 acre of park, not just with the people in this room, but with 1,000 people? That's the kind of thing that we're talking about in the red and orange neighborhoods on this. Does that help? Great. I saw a question, Hannah.
So when you were answering a couple of questions ago, finished by talking about Olin's new emergent model of practice.
Sure, the lab stuff.
Yes, having design before securing funding, and that'll be what's it gonna take for Olin to get it.
What would it take to get to a 50% model of labs? Well, so first I will say that I was making up those stats. So if, one of my 11 partners tomorrow asks you and you say, well, Jessica said in 15 years, she wants to be at 50% of the practice, they'll be like, did she now? Sorry, I'm looking for the slide, but it doesn't matter. So our labs, we started this 6 or 7 years ago with the idea of inquiry around 5 main topics: design, ecology, building systems, technology, and people systems. And we've had a lot of success in certain things. We're actually working on an EPA grant right now for our Soilless Soils project, which is basically looking at how do we think about soils and urban conditions rather than scraping topsoil off of greenland, green fields, and bringing it to our urban projects. How do we actually make soils? So that's a really interesting one. We've also done some other really cool projects about like post-occupancy things. Right now, we have a full-time person that's our research associate that's dedicated to Olin Labs. And through the year, every staff member has the potential to participate. On the scale of maybe a couple of days a month is how much right now people can, if they choose to participate in labs. Some projects are bigger, some are less. I think if we wanted to imagine getting to a place where financially we can support that, I think we would be looking at expanding either our grants applications, which I guess we are doing actively. The pace of that is a question. We look at expanding our grants. A lot of this is looking at long lead items. So for example, the at scale stuff that I showed you, when we started doing that work maybe 18 months ago, it was, hey, Jessica, am interested in this problem. Let's put some resources into it. Now we have 3 clients that are purchasing or paying us to do projects based on that methodology. And so if you count projects like that, where a project comes out of the labs initiative, I think we could get there faster to that sort of model. Because for me personally, as a partner, I would like to see not just 50% of my work, but like almost all of my work coming out of these types of initiatives. So I think grants and long lead investment probably are 2 of the biggest things to push on that. Because at the end of the day, while my staff all loves working on these projects, they also like to get paid. So, there's that. One last question maybe, and then we'll wrap it up. Yeah, okay, one last one.
You mentioned like community land trusts incorporating knowledge of indigenous communities stuff. What role do you think landscape architects have? Persuading isn't really the right word, but like maybe encouraging things like that.
Yeah. So the question is, what role do you think landscape architects have in encouraging things like bringing indigenous voices to the table or developing community land trusts? I think a lot. I think historically, so I won't name any names, but a partner in a well-known firm once said, there's 2 things you can't talk about with your clients, religion and politics. And if you stay away from those topics, you'll be fine. I don't practice that way, right? I actually think politics drive a lot of the decision making. And so I think it's definitely a requirement to speak up. And I find that most clients are happy to know, not to be like rude or like, I know everything, I'm so glad that I'm here to teach you because you're dumb. No, not like that. But to most clients, when you say to them, hey, you know, it's probably not a good thing if you don't involve this community, or you have a big opportunity here to do something that your predecessors haven't done. This is something that's really interesting on the Los Angeles County Master Plan. And I want to be very clear, the table always needs to be getting bigger. Like the number of people invited into these processes, it like needs to continue to grow. LA County, to do this master plan, that was the biggest engagement process they'd ever done in the history of the county. And when you read the master plan, it's the first time in writing that LA County has written that historical practices of redlining and channelization led directly to the disinvestment that we see as legacy issues in the Southeast communities. It's like gives me the chills to say that like LA County has gotten to that point. Is there further to go? For all of us, myself included, for all of our clients. But I think having those open conversations is something that we can do from a place of respect and from a place of like, hey, you hired me to advise you to do the smartest thing. And in this case, this is the smartest thing. And I think most clients will at least hear you out. And then good clients will say, I hear you, let's do it. Or, hey, I hear you, here's why we can't do that now, but how could we do this thing together on this other side? If someone is like, get lost, terrible idea, we don't care about that population, then you probably should just walk out of the room, frankly, so that we're not perpetuating, you know, really bad development and really bad practices. With that, I mean, I work with developers every day, and I actually find that most of them have good intentions for communities and, you know, really are looking to invest. Sure, they're looking to make a profit too, Takako, as you said. But that, you know, that's not necessarily bad because they might also be doing something great for the community. So I think having those conversations is absolutely part of our job. Thank you all for hanging out.